Why do you stop at a red light, say, late at night when no one else is around? I mean, is it because you're worried about a ticket? Or maybe you just think, well, stopping is the right thing to do.
Or maybe it's something else. That simple moment, that small decision, it really opens up this huge age-old question, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. Why, and maybe more importantly, when are you actually obliged to obey political authority?
It's such a fundamental token. This whole idea of political obligation, it goes right to the core of, well, your relationship with the state.
How far does that obligation go? What actually gives the state the right to tell you what to do? And are there limits? Points where maybe that obligation just stops.
Exactly. Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive into precisely that. We're looking at the grounds and the limits of political obligation.
We're going to try and unpack this really core problem in political philosophy. We'll explore why different thinkers, across different times, have come up with such, well, really different answers.
Yeah, and for this, we're drawing on a fantastic source text that lays out these diverse historical and philosophical viewpoints. And one thing it makes clear right away is, look, there's no single, easy, universally accepted answer here. It's complex.
And you know what? That's all right. Like our source says, the real value isn't always in finding the definitive answer. Sometimes it's more about understanding the problem itself, seeing it from all these different angles.
Understanding the different ways people have reasoned about it, that's where the illumination comes from.
So our mission today is to unpack some of these key theories. We want to get into their reasoning, see their strengths, their weaknesses maybe, and ultimately see what they might suggest about your own place in society.
Yeah, your relationship with the state and what it demands of you. It might lead to some surprising perspectives.
Okay, let's dive in. First things first, let's define the core problem. What exactly is political obligation for the purpose of this discussion?
Right. So at its most basic level, political obligation really focuses on this question. How far, when, and why are you, as an individual, obliged to obey the law and the commands that come from political authority?
It's the philosophical search for the reasons why you should feel bound by the rules and the rulers of the society you live in.
Exactly. And it's not just about, avoiding punishment. It goes deeper than just not wanting to get caught breaking a rule.
Right. Our source mentions it covers a kind of broader set of duties, doesn't it? Things citizens are generally expected to do.
Absolutely. Duties that are seen as, well, necessary for political institutions to even function, to be maintained. Paying taxes is the classic one, right?
Right. Maybe not always popular, but essential.
Essential for the state to operate, and it requires a level of compliance that's more than just, say, not stealing from your neighbor.
Or things like participating in political life, voting, maybe serving on a jury if called.
Uh-huh. And in some places, historically or even now, military service falls under this too. These are all seen, broadly speaking, as parts of your political obligation.
And political philosophy's job here, as our source puts it, isn't just to list these duties, it's to dig into the why.
Yes, what are the logical grounds? What are the moral grounds that justify requiring individuals to do these things? Philosophy tries to define the proper scope of this obligation and, this is key, its limits.
When is it okay to push back? Or even say no?
Exactly. And that, as we said up front, immediately brings in the complexity. The source is really honest about this. There isn't one single grand theory everyone agrees on.
The value is in exploring the different arguments, seeing how they hold up, like looking at a complex sculpture from all sides.
And often, these different viewpoints cluster together. You get theories arguing for pretty much absolute obedience, and others arguing it's much more conditional.
Okay, let's start with the really strong claims then. Theories of unlimited obligation. These argue you should obey the state pretty much no matter what.
Right. And perhaps the most basic starting point here is what's sometimes called force majeure, basically the rule of superior strength.
Force majeure. That sounds like legal jargon almost, but it just means superior force, irresistible compulsion.
That's it. And the idea is incredibly simple, almost brutal. You obey because the state is stronger than you, period.
So the state's power, its ability to force you, to punish you, that is the source of the obligation.
According to this view, yes. Why obey? Because if you don't, they'll make you regret it. Obedience comes from fear. Fear of punishment, fear of unpleasant consequences.
So the authority is the government, and the source of its authority is just its overwhelming power.
And the conclusion is stark. Because you, the individual, are weak compared to the state, your political obligation is unlimited. You obey because you have to, because successful defiance is Basically impossible.
But our source, well, it raises some serious objections to this, right? As a philosophical basis for obligation.
Oh, absolutely. A devastating critique, really. The biggest problem is it's not based on any moral ground at all. It's just might makes right.
It explains why someone might obey out of fear, but not why they should feel a duty beyond that fear.
Exactly. There's no right or wrong involved, just power. It completely ignores your ability to judge whether a law is just or unjust.
It doesn't want willing obedience based on conviction or agreement.
No, it wants fearful compliance. And obviously, it forbids any kind of resistance, even against terrible laws, because resistance is seen as pointless against superior force.
The analogy the source uses is quite powerful, isn't it?
It is. It compares this kind of obedience to handing your wallet over to an armed robber.
Yeah.
You do it because you're under threat, fearing for your safety, not because you feel any obligation or duty to the robber.
That's fundamentally different from, say, following your doctor's advice, even if it's difficult because you trust it's for your own good.
Precisely. And because it lacks that moral core, relying purely on coercion, the source basically says force majeure isn't really a proper theory of political obligation. It describes power, yes, but not philosophical duty.
Okay, so pure force isn't a solid foundation for obligation. What about another historical claim to absolute authority, the divine right theory?
Ah, yes, shifting from earthly power to heavenly mandate. This theory says the ruler, usually a king, gets their authority directly from God.
So obeying the king is like obeying God, a religious duty as much as a civic one.
Exactly. It's seen as essential. Our source mentions hints of this in ancient India, but it really developed in Europe, especially during the rise of monarchies. Thinkers like Robert Filmer were big proponents.
And while it's less common now in secular states, the source notes it persisted more recently in places like pre-communist Tibet or some traditional kingdoms.
And because the authority comes from God's will, which is seen as binding on everyone, this theory naturally leads to unlimited political obligation. You can't really question or resist God's chosen representative.
The basis is clearly religious, not philosophical in the sense of reasoned moral principles, and the consequences are, again, pretty severe.
Yeah. If the king is a tyrant, well, according to the theory, you still have to obey him. His tyranny might even be seen as God's punishment for the people's sins, but your duty to obey remains.
The source mentions King James I of England using this exact argument to justify his absolute rule.
Right. Now, the source also brings up an interesting point, comparing divine right to charismatic authority. But it finds the comparison isn't quite right.
Charismatic authority, that's more about the leader's personal magnetism, right? Their perceived special qualities that inspire people to follow them.
Exactly. It's very personal, often fades when the leader is gone. Think of certain revolutionary leaders, perhaps.
But divine right usually involves inheritance, doesn't it? The right passes down a family line.
Precisely. That makes it closer to what sociologists call traditional authority. Authority based on established custom, inherited status, things that have always been done this way. It's less about the individual's personality and more about the inherited position.
And like force majeure, the source's critique here is pretty sharp.
Very. Divine right theory also denies your ability to judge right and wrong for yourself. It forbids resisting unjust laws, because that would be resisting God's agent.
So again, the source concludes it's hardly a sound basis for political obligation, especially if you value individual conscience or justice beyond a ruler's interpretation of divine will.
So neither brute force nor a claim to rule directly from God, in these absolute forms anyway, seem to provide a basis for obligation that respects the individual as a moral thinker.
Okay, that leads us to a third perspective that often leans towards unconditional obedience, but for very different reasons. The conservative view.
Yes, this one is grounded more in practical realities and the value placed on tradition.
The core idea seems to be that having some kind of government, even if it's flawed, is usually better than the alternative chaos, anarchy. David Hume comes up here.
Right, Hume, the Scottish philosopher.
Yeah.
He argued quite strongly that, look, the practical advantages of obeying any established political authority generally outweigh the dangers of living without one.
Order and stability are paramount.
For Hume, yes. This practical utility becomes the basis for what effectively amounts to unconditional political obligation. You obey because it works, or at least it prevents society falling apart, which is worse.
Then there's Edmund Burke, thinking about tradition and social continuity. He was writing, reacting to the French Revolution, wasn't he?
He was, and he saw it as incredibly destructive, not just physically, but because it tore apart the very fabric of society, the evolved relationships and institutions.
He was deeply skeptical of radical change, wasn't he? Believed it destroyed complex systems without knowing how to replace them.
Exactly. He argued against messing with established institutions too much. He had this very organic view of society.
Like a living thing.
Yes, or an incredibly complex mechanism. A constitution for Burke wasn't something designed overnight. It was the product of countless minds and adaptations over generations. Trying to impose abstract theories onto it, or tinkering recklessly, was bound to have terrible, unforeseen consequences.
Society is too delicate for radical experiments.
That was his fear. And bringing this sort of thinking more recently, the source mentions Michael Oakeshott, a 20th century conservative. He had this interesting phrase describing politics.
As the pursuit of intimations of the traditions of behavior, what does that actually mean?
It means, I think, that you don't find political goals by looking at abstract ideals or philosophies from outside. You find them by paying close attention to how your specific community already operates, its customs, its history, its implicit understandings. Politics is about navigating and gently extending those existing traditions.
So not a grand project, more like following the existing currents.
Oakeshott compared it to an informal conversation rather than a planned debate. It unfolds according to its own internal logic, responding to things as they come up, not following a pre-written script.
And how does that relate to political obligation for him?
Well, he saw obligation as similarly diffuse. It doesn't come from signing a contract or following strict rules. The source uses the analogy of friendship. The obligations you feel towards a friend aren't written down, they don't follow a formula, but they arise naturally from the relationship itself.
So obligation is just part of being involved in the life of the community.
Pretty much. It's incidental to participating in the shared political and social life. It arises from being part of those traditions, not from aiming at some grand external goal.
Okay, so the conservative view grounds obligation less in your explicit agreement or abstract morals, and more in legitimacy derived from tradition, established practice, and the practical need for order. You obey partly because this is how we do things, it has generally worked, and messing with it is risky.
It's a very different foundation from the next big group of theories.
Yeah.
We need to look at those arguing for limited political obligation, often grounding it in the individual's consent.
Right, this is where we shift focus. From external pressures like force or tradition to something involving your own free will, your agreement, the key idea is consent.
The starting point is often that famous idea. Man is born free. And if you're born free, then any legitimate authority over you, any obligation to obey, must somehow come from your own consent. Government power flows from the consent of the governed.
But consent itself can be tricky. What does it mean in practice? Our source mentions different kinds, like tacit consent.
Tacit consent is the idea that, look, just by living in a place, using its roads, accepting its protection, abiding by its rules, you're implicitly agreeing to its authority. You haven't signed anything, but your actions show consent.
But some argue that's not enough, right? Just living somewhere doesn't mean you truly consent to everything the government does.
Exactly. They argue true obligation needs something more active. People must have somehow created the authority through their consent, or at least explicitly agreed to be bound by it at some point.
And the source says the most famous and developed version of this consent idea is the social contract theory.
Ah, yes. The big names here are Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Right. And they all use this idea of a hypothetical state of nature, a time before government.
That's the shared starting point, yes. They imagine what life was like before political authority. Then the social contract is the imagined agreement people make to leave that state of nature and form a civil society, setting up a state. The terms of that imaginary contract define the basis and the limits of political obligation.
Okay, let's start with Hobbes. His state of nature sounds, frankly, terrifying.
It really is. Hobbes thought without a strong ruler, life would be a constant war of each against all. People are driven by self-interest, fear, competition. Life would be, in his famous words, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short.
Not a place you'd want to stay. So the motivation to contract out is pretty strong.
Absolutely. Driven by the fundamental desire for self-preservation, people rationally agree to give up their natural rights, their freedom, to do whatever they want to a newly created sovereign power,
The Leviathan.
the Leviathan. This absolute power is needed to enforce peace and prevent society collapsing back into that brutal state of nature.
And for Hobbes, this giving up of rights is total and permanent.
Yes, it has to be final and irrevocable in his view. Any right to resist would risk undoing the whole point, plunging everyone back into chaos.
So Hobbes ends up arguing for unlimited political obligation. You must obey the sovereign. But crucially, it's based on consent.
That's the key to his argument. You consented to this absolute rule out of rational self-interest to save yourself. Even if a ruler comes to power through conquest, Hobbes argues their rule only becomes legitimate when the conquered people tacitly consent by choosing obedience over continued feudal struggle. The obligation ultimately stems from that initial agreement, however motivated by fear.
But the source points out a big problem here. Hobbes creates this all-powerful Leviathan to save us from anarchy.
But provides no way to control the Leviathan if it becomes the source of terror and oppression. You've given up all your rights, so you have no recourse against a tyrannical sovereign you created.
Which is where John Locke comes in with a very different picture. His state of nature wasn't so bad.
Not nearly as bleak.
Yeah.
Locke saw humans as rational, capable of understanding and generally following natural law, moral principles accessible through reason. His state of nature was governed by these laws, ensuring rights to life, liberty, and property. It was a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation, mostly.
So why leave it then, if it's mostly peaceful?
Locke argued there were certain inconveniences, mainly the lack of an impartial judge to settle disputes and enforce the natural law fairly. In the state of nature, everyone enforces the law themselves, which can lead to bias and escalating conflicts.
Ah, okay. So the surrender in Locke's social contract is much more specific.
Much more limited. People don't surrender all their rights. They primarily give up the right to be their own judge and executioner of the natural law.
They hand that power over to the community, to the state.
Exactly. And the state is created by mutual consent, but it's established as a trust. Its job, its whole purpose, is limited to protect the natural rights, life, liberty, property that people already possessed in the state of nature.
And this is the absolute crucial difference for political obligation, isn't it?
It is, because it's a trust. If the government breaks that trust, if it fails to protect those rights, or worse, actively violates them, then the people have the right to dissolve that government.
So Locke argues for limited political obligation. Your duty to obey is conditional.
Conditional on the government upholding its end of the bargain. If it becomes tyrannical, the contract is broken, your obligation ceases, and you regain the right to resist, even to revolt and set up a new government that will protect your rights. The source really highlights Locke as the one among these three who clearly establishes conditional consent, leading directly to limited obligation.
Okay, on to the third major social contract thinker, Rousseau. His state of nature sounds almost nice.
Rousseau paints this picture of early humans living in idyllic blissfulness, simple, close to nature, enjoying natural liberty, freedom from society's constraints.
Sounds lovely. Why on earth would they leave that?
Well, Rousseau argued that as population grew and private property emerged, things went downhill. Scarcity, dependence, inequality, conflict arose. This created a tension within people between their actual will, their immediate selfish desires, and their real will, their deeper rational self-interest, which Rousseau believed aligns with the good of the whole community.
Okay, so the social contract for Rousseau is about resolving that internal conflict.
Yes, individuals overcome the problems of the later state of nature by uniting and agreeing to put themselves completely under the direction of the general will.
The general will. That's a really central, maybe tricky concept for Rousseau.
It is. It's not just the sum of what everyone wants individually. He called that the will of all. The general will is supposed to represent the common interest, the collective good, what everyone would want if they were thinking rationally and for the benefit of the whole community.
So in this contract, you trade your natural liberty for civil liberty, which is protected by the laws created by the general will.
Right. But here's the thing. Like Hobbes, Rousseau ends up arguing for absolute sovereignty and unlimited political obligation.
But wait, how is it unlimited if it's based on the general will, which is kind of the people's collective will?
Because the general will, representing the common good and your own real will, cannot err, according to Rousseau. The obligation isn't owed to some external king, but to the collective community itself, of which you are a part.
So obeying the general will is like obeying your own higher self.
That's the idea. Rousseau even argued that if someone refuses to obey the general will, the community can force him to be free. because they're making him act in accordance with his own true, rational interests, even if his lower selfish desires resist.
That sounds potentially problematic in practice.
And the source points that out. Theoretically, the sovereign is the community, the general will aims for the common good, but in reality, sovereignty is exercised by a government made of ordinary, fallible people.
Who might easily mistake their own interests or their faction's interests for the general will.
Precisely. Rousseau himself preferred small, direct democracies where maybe the general will could be more easily discerned. But for large modern states, the source notes, his model doesn't really provide a check against potential government abuse, even with its different philosophical justification.
And the source also raises a general point about all these social contract theories relying on consent given just once, way back when.
Yeah, this idea of consent given once for all. How does an agreement made hypothetically or by distant ancestors really bind you today? It seems a bit thin as the sole basis for ongoing obligation.
So maybe a government based on consent needs.
Ongoing consent. That's what the source suggests. A truly consent-based government should probably rely on the continuous consent of the people, maybe through regular elections, active participation, and responsiveness. In that light, Locke's model, with its right to withdraw consent if the trust is broken, seems perhaps a bit more grounded in that ongoing dynamic.
Okay, so consent theories can lead to either absolute or limited obligation. Let's shift to another school arguing for limited obligation, the idealist view.
Right. And this school actually started out leaning towards unconditional obedience, but then shifted quite significantly.
The source mentions Hegel first. He had a very high view of the state.
Extremely high. Hegel famously called the state the incarnation of divine reason, the march of God on earth.
Wow, so obeying the state was like participating in divine reason itself.
That was his view. It was the highest expression of ethical life, the way freedom becomes concrete in the world. So for Hegel, political obligation was unlimited. Resisting the state was essentially irrational, immoral.
But the source notes a criticism. He didn't always clearly separate the ideal state from the actual flawed governments we see.
Exactly. And that ambiguity, unfortunately, had some terrible consequences later on.
The source mentions fascist regimes twisting Hegel's ideas.
Yes, invoking his arguments for unconditional obedience to justify their own absolute power, leading to catastrophe. It's a stark warning about how philosophical ideas can be misused.
But then the idealist tradition changed, particularly with T.H. Green.
Yes, Green, writing later in the 19th century, took idealism in a very different direction. He explicitly rejected the idea that government could claim unconditional obedience.
That's a major shift from Hegel. So if allegiance isn't owed unconditionally to the government, where does Green say it is owed?
Green argued allegiance is primarily owed to society, not the state or government as separate entities. The real political authority, the source of obligation, is the organized power of society.
And this ties into his idea of the common good.
Absolutely. For Green, society, the network of relationships, shared life, common interests, is the real center of the common good. His view of humans was key here, too.
Not just pleasure seekers like the utilitarians thought.
No. Green saw humans as rational, self-conscious beings driven by will and reason. Crucially, he believed we realize our potential for good only in community with others. Our individual good is tied up with the common good.
So individual versus community wasn't the right way to think about it.
He thought the question of which comes first was misguided. Individuals need the community is made of individuals. The real foundation is people recognizing each other's capacity for pursuing shared goals and values, treating each other as ends, not just means.
And this links politics and morality very closely for him.
They share the same goal,
Yeah.
improving people's moral character. So institutions and laws should be judged by whether they help citizens develop their reason and goodwill.
This requires freedom, then, for self-development.
Yes, freedom understood as equal opportunity for everyone to develop their potential. And the state's main job is to create the conditions that make this freedom possible.
What does this mean for law? Can law make people moral?
Green said no. Law can force you to act in certain ways externally, but morality requires free will, good intention. This led to his famous statement, "Will, not force, is the basis of the state."
A direct challenge to those earlier theories based on power.
Definitely. So Green grounds obligation in our moral nature and the pursuit of common good defined by the citizens within society. The state is just an instrument for that purpose.
And by shifting the focus from the state itself to the organized power of society pursuing the common good, he undermines any claim the government might make to unconditional obedience.
Precisely. Harold Lasky is also mentioned here, arguing similarly that the government has to earn our allegiance by competing with other associations in promoting our welfare. It further limits the state's claim.
So these idealist revisions provide another route to limited conditional obligation based on the state's role in fostering a moral community.
We've covered a lot of ground. Unlimited obligation from force, divine right, or tradition, limited obligation from different kinds of consent, or from serving the common good. But there's another category entirely.
Right, those who just reject the whole idea, theories against political obligation.
Exactly. These perspectives argue you don't actually have any obligation to obey the state at all.
First up is the Marxist view, which has a very specific critical take on what the state is.
Very specific. For Marxists, the state isn't neutral. It's not for everyone. It's the tool of the dominant economic class, the owners of the means of production.
So its purpose isn't the general welfare, but serving the interests of the powerful, helping them exploit the less powerful.
That's the core analysis. And if that's what the state is, then in a class-divided society, the working class has no political obligation towards it. Why be obliged to obey the instrument of your own oppression?
So if obligation exists, it's not to the state.
Not under capitalism. Obligation, for Marxists, is owed only to society if and when it becomes classless and stateless, the communist future. Until then, the workers' primary obligation is to their own class.
Which means an obligation against the current state.
Yes, it implies solidarity with other workers, organizing and ultimately working towards revolution to overthrow the capitalist state and build that classless society. So it's not just no obligation, it's an obligation to actively resist and dismantle.
Taking that rejection even further, we have the anarchist view.
Anarchism aims to abolish all organized authority, the state included. The goal is a society based on free association, voluntary cooperation, spontaneous order without any external force compelling people.
So their position on political obligation is basically none, a negative obligation.
Fundamentally, yes, an obligation not to obey the state. Thinkers like Proudhon, property theft, or Kropotkin, emphasizing mutual aid, saw government authority as inherently illegitimate. The state, for them, is coercive, corrupting, only suited for an unjust society.
So the only real obligation is to justice itself.
To justice, freedom, cooperation. Which, again, implies an obligation to resist the state as the main barrier to achieving that, and to build alternative ways of living based on voluntary agreement. The source connects this to the ultimate stateless visions in Marxism and Gandhism, too.
That brings us neatly to the Gandhian perspective. Gandhi didn't reject political obligation entirely, did he? But he certainly saw limits.
Very clear and crucial limits, especially when faced with injustice. His principle of civil disobedience is absolutely key here.
Civil disobedience meaning deliberately breaking an unjust law or defying an unjust authority.
Yes, and the source describes it beautifully. It's a counterpart to the duty to obey a just law. If you have a moral duty to follow just laws, maybe you also have a moral duty to refuse unjust ones.
And it's a tool for protest, for demanding reform.
A powerful one. The term itself comes from Henry David Thoreau, the American writer, who refused to pay taxes to protest slavery and the Mexican-American War. He argued you have to actively resist your own government's injustice.
Lasky also mentioned conscientious objectors in WWI refusing service out of principle, knowing they'd be punished.
Right. But Gandhi really developed it, embedding civil disobedience within his philosophy of satyagraha, truth force, or nonviolent struggle.
The Salt March is the famous example, defying the British salt monopoly nonviolently.
A perfect illustration. And Gandhi was incredibly specific about the conditions for civil disobedience. It wasn't something to be done lightly or for selfish reasons.
No, it had to be based on a deep respect for law in general. You disobey the unjust law precisely because you value justice and lawfulness.
And only the unjust law should be broken. And only after you've tried absolutely everything else, petitioning, negotiation, persuasion, and failed.
And crucially, it must be nonviolent. No hatred towards the opponent. And done openly, publicly.
Yes, never secretively. And perhaps the most challenging part.
Yeah.
You must willingly accept the consequences, the punishment for breaking the law, whether it's jail, fines, whatever. That willing suffering is part of the protest's moral force.
The goal wasn't just to cause trouble, but a change of heart in the authorities, appealing to their conscience.
That was the ultimate aim. And Gandhi believed it was a tool primarily for situations of real tyranny, foreign oppression, or fundamentally unjust governments.
Not for everyday disagreements or when democratic channels are open?
No. If a government generally respects rights and can be influenced democratically, civil disobedience isn't necessary. And it should never be used just to push the demands of one group against the common good. It had to be principled, for a just cause benefiting all.
So Gandhi offers this path of obligation conditional on justice, requiring immense discipline, nonviolence, and respect for law itself, even while disobeying a specific unjust law.
It's a profound perspective on the limits of obedience.
Okay, we've really journeyed through a huge range of ideas. From absolute obedience based on fear or God, to consent-based theories, both absolute and limited, obligations to society's common good, outright rejection, and this nuanced path of civil disobedience.
It just hammers home how complex political obligation is, doesn't it? The grounds, the limits, they really need careful thought before you just accept the state's claim on you.
And, philosophers talk about these big ideas, the general will, the divine state, organized society as maybe the things we're obliged to. But how do we actually experience political authority in our lives?
Well, mostly through the government, right? Through the laws they make, the police who enforce them, the agencies we deal with. As Lasky pointed out, when the state claims supreme authority, what that means in practice is the authority of a government made up of fallible people.
And their good intentions or their claims to represent some higher ideal aren't automatically enough to justify the huge power they have.
Which leads to a really crucial point the source makes, empowering you, the individual. Government is something humans created. It's an instrument. But your own ability to reason, to judge right from wrong, that stays with you. You don't surrender your conscience to the machine.
So fundamentally, you remain the best judge of whether a particular law or action is just or unjust.
In a deep sense, yes. And this is the immediate vital counterpoint. From the source, you're not alone. No single person is always wiser than everyone else combined.
Right. So your personal judgment that a law is unjust needs something more before you act publicly against it.
It needs to be tested, shared, debated. The source strongly suggests that deciding to actively oppose or resist should ideally happen only when public opinion has largely formed around the issue. It requires engaging with others, trying to understand different views, seeking some consensus.
That tension, again, between individual conscience and collective action. Your judgment matters, but acting on it socially involves navigating that shared public space.
And the source adds some very practical warnings about resistance, too. For instance, just because a government isn't perfect doesn't solve every single problem, like unemployment or healthcare.
That's not automatically grounds for resistance. No government solves everything, given real-world limits.
Exactly. And you should always try the normal democratic channels: first voting, protesting peacefully, lobbying before resorting to more extreme measures like strikes or mass disobedience.
And even justified resistance needs limits. Burke's idea. It's medicine, not daily food.
Right. Aim for specific reforms, review the results. Revolution, if it comes to that, needs to be about building something new, not just tearing down the old indiscriminately.
There's also that danger, the source notes, that even a principled leader of resistance might attract followers with less noble motives, leading things astray.
A very real risk. And finally, the difficulty of rebuilding. Smashing the old order without a solid plan for what comes next is often disastrous. To destroy is easy, to reconstruct is difficult. Any justified resistance needs a vision for the future.
So, reflecting on all this, we've seen the spectrum. Blind obedience demanded by force or divine right. Obedience offered conditionally through consent or for the common good. Outright rejection by Marxists and anarchists. Principle, limited disobedience with Gandhi.
It really underscores that there's no simple formula. It's always going to be this tension, this balancing act between the state's need for order and your own conscience, your own judgment about justice and freedom.
And it's not just abstract philosophy, is it? Every time you pay a tax you resent, or decide whether to vote, or feel that unease about a law, you're wrestling with this very problem of political obligation.
Absolutely. Maybe a key thought to leave you with is this. The source suggests you retain that ultimate judgment about justice. But perhaps that judgment only gains real traction for public action when it connects with others, when it's debated, and when a shared sense of injustice crystallizes in the community. What does that really mean for how you balance your personal conscience with your role in collective decision-making?
Definitely something to ponder. Maybe even next time you find yourself waiting at that red light.
Maybe so.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex, sometimes contradictory, but always fascinating world of political obligation. We hope exploring these different perspectives gives you a richer framework for thinking about your own relationship with the state and its laws.
Until next time.